Denver right now is collapsing. Volunteers are scrambling to help migrant families left without shelters as Denver is now cutting back many of its migrant services. Now, why is Denver doing this when they're such a big advocate for being a sanctuary city? And by the way, many different citizens do not like this. Most of the citizens say Denver didn't have to be a sanctuary city. Denver is doing so good in terms of real estate, business, and being a post-pandemic boom town. Now they play migrant card, and now they're going bankrupt. Denver is actually spending hundreds of millions of dollars on migrant crisis, so much to the point that they actually have to close these shelters or else they risk collapsing the whole city. So Denver now has 40,000 migrants. Many of the migrants are now sleeping on the streets. They have to rely on volunteers to help out some of these migrant families. And you're going to be seeing a lot of tents on the side of the streets, a lot of porta potties, and just a lot of people homeless on the streets of Denver. Denver basically destroyed itself within just a few months period. I mean, look at San Francisco. The reason why they have such a big exodus of companies and people is because there's literally tents everywhere, homelessness everywhere, and crime everywhere. Same thing's happening in Denver. Had everything going for them, and they decided to play this, and now they have the highest migrant per capita count. And this is what's happening in Denver. Nearly 90% of people who are homeless in Denver were already living in Colorado, and about the whole homeless situation, it is skyrocketing right now. If you look into the Denver streets and many of the live reports, it seems like Denver is having a crisis. Before the migrant crisis, they actually managed a homeless population somewhat decent. But now with so many migrants homeless, so many migrants being kicked out of shelters, and only a few thousand migrants live in shelters now versus tens of thousands now living on the streets. And look at this. Some migrants in Denver actually prefer the tent encampments than shelters. The shelters are actually so badly managed. They're actually pretty horrible. Some of the conditions aren't exactly the best in the world. And some actually prefer just to live on the streets in like a tent. We're seeing Denver's downtown being converted into just a massive tent city. In fact, Denver right now is collapsing so hard that they're begging the surrounding communities and cities to take in migrants for them, which many cities next to Denver, like Lakewood, have protested and have said no to a single migrant. Not because they're meanies, it's because they simply can't take in this sort of traffic. If you've ever been to Lakewood, it's a very small suburban city. They might have a Whole Foods, they might have a Walmart, a Best Buy, but that's really it. It's mostly just suburban houses and towns. I don't think a little city like that could take in a few thousand migrants. Look at what happened to Denver. They're spending every single penny on the migrant crisis, cutting hours to DMV, cutting hours to Parks and Rec, and literally spending all the heavy tax dollars on the migrant crisis instead of spending all the tax dollars on improving the city. We're also getting crime up almost 3,000% at hotel converted to homeless shelter in downtown Denver. Denver is also experiencing a massive crime wave as well, especially with all sorts of different things happening in the migrant crisis. There's barely any control. Like I said, when you're relying on volunteers, when you're relying on private landlords to supply food, water, shelter, and you yourself at a city can't afford all these different things, you know you really screwed up. Denver right now is experiencing one of the biggest downfalls in terms of city progress. Like I said, they did so well, and now they're doing so incredibly bad. The homeless situation is out of control right now. Many businesses who thought about investing millions of dollars in Denver have now halted their cash. And now we're seeing Denver being one of the worst cities in the U.S. to live in right now. If you also look at the hospital system of Denver, it's also collapsing. We're seeing hundreds of millions of dollars being owed to the hospitals of Denver, which the Denver government cannot pay. We're seeing thousands of emergency visits every few months for many of these hospitals, with many locals being turned away because emergency and other services in the doctor's office are so incredibly full. Let's see what happens to Denver. Hopefully they recover, but right now it's just bad news all around.